Holding a heavy clipboard makes people take moral issues more seriously. Weight equals importance. Wow. In studies, participants holding a heavy clipboard allocated more funding to social causes than those holding a light clipboard. What is going on here? I'm wondering if people, like, who's taking a hold of these and like trying to leverage them? Like, are companies doing this? Are politicians doing this? Science is moving quickly. So it seems like this is where people are at, even though the stuff feels magical and fake in some cases. We're looking into the basis of embodied processes or bodily processes and how it affects our moral judgments and moral thought. All right, the embodied conscience, a comprehensive analysis of the biological and rational foundations of moral judgment. Introduction, the inquiry into the nature of human morality, specifically the extent to which it is tethered to physiological states, emotional intuitions, and embodied experiences versus abstract rationality, represents one of the most profound and enduring convergences of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. For centuries, this domain was dominated by a rigid philosophical dichotomy. On one side stood the rationalists, who posited that moral truths are objective realities accessible via a priori reasoning, much like mathematical truths. On the other stood the sentimentalists, who argued that morality is fundamentally a matter of feeling, a projection of our internal affective states onto the world. All right, the user's query: how much does morality depend on our body/emotions? How rational is it? Strikes at the heart of this interdisciplinary struggle. It challenges us to reconcile the sensation of the moral imperative with the biological wetware that generates it. If morality is merely a spasm of the gut or a fluctuation in vagal tone, can it lay claim to objective authority? If it is purely rational, why does it falter when the brain's emotional centers are damaged? This report provides an exhaustive analysis of the mechanisms underlying moral judgment. It traverses the philosophical landscape of rationalism versus sentimentalism, examines the evolutionary purpose of moral emotions, dissects the social intuitionist and dual process models of psychology, and details the neurobiological substrates that make moral experience possible. The evidence synthesized herein suggests that the separation of reason and emotion is a false dichotomy. Instead, moral judgment appears to be a complex functional integration of evolutionarily ancient emotional systems and more recently evolved cognitive control mechanisms. While humans possess the capacity for rational moral deliberation, this capacity is frequently deployed post hoc to justify intuitive, affect-laden responses. Furthermore, these intuitive responses are not ethereal. They are deeply grounded in somatic states, interoceptive awareness, vagal tone, and even physical disgust, demonstrating that moral cognition is fundamentally embodied. Ultimately, the analysis posits that morality is neither wholly rational nor wholly emotional, but is a product of a rational sentimentalism, where biological imperatives shape the boundaries of what we deem right and wrong, yet remain subject to the regulatory oversight of higher cognitive faculties. Right. And we can go into how much the higher cognitive faculties are intertwined with emotions at a later date. We can consider how those faculties work and what it means in regards to pattern recognition and memory formation. Evolutionary psychology suggests that the physiological and emotional mechanisms underpinning morality were selected not for their truth-tracking ability, but for their ability to foster social cohesion and cooperation. Robert Triver's theory of reciprocal altruism explains how moral behaviors could evolve in a self-interested world. In his seminal work, Trivers argued that emotions such as guilt, gratitude, and moralistic aggression evolved as adaptation mechanisms to regulate the system of altruism. Gratitude ensures we repay debts, maintain cooperative relationships. Guilt motivates reparation when we cheat, preventing the dissolution of valuable alliances. Moralistic aggression, anger, punishes cheaters, enforcing the stability of the group. Okay, these emotions act as commitment devices, binding individuals to cooperative strategies even when immediate rational self-interest, for example, stealing resources without being caught, might dictate otherwise. Thus, the irrationality of sticking to moral principles, even when it costs us personally, is, from an evolutionary perspective, a long-term rational strategy for genetic success. The function of moral emotions. Moral emotions are not mere merely byproducts. They are the engine of moral conduct. Research distinguishes between other condemning emotions, anger, disgust, contempt, and self-conscious emotions, shame, guilt, embarrassment. The distinction between guilt and shame is particularly illustrative of the body's role. Guilt focuses on the action, I did a bad thing, I just did a bad thing, and motivates fixing it. Shame focuses on the self, I am bad, and motivates hiding. This differentiation suggests distinct neural and physiological pathways for regulating social behavior. Okay, evolutionary mismatch. When instincts fail, our moral instincts evolved in the Pleistocene environment, small, tight-knit hunter-gatherer groups. In the modern world, these instincts can misfire, leading to judgments that are biologically rational, adaptive for genes, but ethically irrational, inconsistent with modern values. For example, xenophobia, fear of strangers, was adaptive for protecting the tribe from potential aggressors or pathogens, but it manifests as racism or xenophobia in modern diverse societies. Similarly, the instinct to feel empathy is heavily based toward identifiable victims and members of our in-group, making us irrationally insensitive to large-scale statistical suffering, for example, climate change or genocides in distant lands. Right, as Sam Harris has pointed out, we care much more about the one suffering girl across the world than we do hundreds of thousands of people, somewhere else. He just points out that one is so much more salient for you. This mismatch implies that relying solely on body/emotion morality is often irrational in the context of global ethics, as our biological hardware is not calibrated for the scale of modern moral problems. All right, the social intuitionist model, the emotional dog. The most significant psychological challenge to the rationalist view comes from Jonathan Haidt's social intuitionist model. Haidt proposes that moral judgment is caused by quick automatic intuitions, the emotional dog, so we all have that dog in us, while moral reasoning is a post hoc process, the rational tail, used primarily for social justification rather than truth-seeking. The SIM posits that when we encounter a moral situation, we have an immediate flash of affect, a gut feeling of like or dislike. And I don't think he comes up with this. I think this is all kind of built on the somatic marker hypothesis. This intuition is the judgment. Reasoning comes later, only if we are challenged to explain ourselves. Intuitive judgment, post hoc reasoning, reason, persuasion. This model flips the traditional view on its head. We do not reason to find the truth. We intuit the truth and use reason to defend it. This explains why moral arguments are so often futile. Unless you can change the person's intuition, their emotional state, their reasoning will simply construct a new defense for their existing view. So this is a huge deal. This we see all the time today. Moral dumbfounding, the smoking gun. The strongest evidence for the primacy of emotion over reason is the phenomenon of moral dumbfounding. In classic experiments, Haidt and colleagues presented subjects with scenarios that were harmless but taboo. It has this visceral reaction, but then people were unable to actually explain why it was immoral. The cannibal scenario. A woman is cleaning out her closet and she finds her old family flag. She doesn't want it anymore, so she cuts it up into pieces and uses the rags to clean her bathroom. That's a scenario. Subjects consistently judge these actions as wrong. When asked why, they would offer reasons. When the experimenter pointed out that the scenario explicitly ruled these risks out, birth control was used or they remained close, subjects did not change their judgment. Instead, they entered a state of dumbfounding. I don't know. I can't explain it. I just know it's wrong. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I guess this just points out that someone can have a moral judgment without rational reasons, right? That's all this points out. This doesn't point out that rationality is it suggests that there might be more to morality than the reasons. You could say that it's still a rational thought, even though you don't have the reasons for it. But then you have to figure out what rational means here. And I would point out that rational might be most closely tied to the feeling of it is rational than some externally judged rational because of reasons. It's more so rational because of conclusion, and anyone gets to infer whether the conclusion is apt. Okay, this phenomenon demonstrates that judgment is driven by an emotional response, likely disgust, and the reasoning is merely a fabrication attempting to support the feeling. When the reasons fail, the feeling and the judgment remains. The body, disgust reaction, has already decided, and the mind is left scrambling to catch up. Critiques of SIM, the role of prior reasoning. While SIM has been influential, it is not without detractors. Bizarro and Bloom argue that Haidt underestimates the role of private reasoning. They suggest that while specific judgments may be intuitive, these intuitions are often shaped by prior reasoning and cultural learning. Aha. So it would be prior reasoning that led to this feeling that you have in the moment without the reasons manifesting. So once again, we kind of come down to a semantic issue of what it would mean for your thoughts to be rational. If they're affected by the affective parts of your brain and body, the affective mechanisms, but they were internalized via actually rational thinking, then how do you judge what is actually rational thinking? It's a difficult question. For example, a person may intuitively reject racism today, not because of an innate biological module, but because they have previously reasoned or been taught via reasoning about equality, and this reasoning has settled into an automatic intuition. Okay, they reject it not because of the innate module, but because they have previously reasoned. Okay, furthermore, individuals with high need for cognition are more likely to engage in genuine deliberation that can override intuition. Studies show that when people are given time and encouragement to think, they can sometimes reverse their intuitive judgments, moving from a disgust-based condemnation to a harm-based permission. Recent studies also suggest that dumbfounding might not be purely irrational. Subjects may be responding to probabilistic risks. For example, the high probability that incest usually does lead to harm, rather than the specific artificial certainty of the experimental vignette. The rationalist response argues that subjects are acting as Bayesian updaters, refusing to accept the zero-risk premise because it violates their prior world knowledge. The neuroscience of moral judgment, the brain and the body. If morality depends on the body and emotions, there must be identifiable neural substrates that process these signals. Neuroscience has provided overwhelming evidence that moral judgment relies heavily on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the integration of somatic states. Here we go, the somatic marker hypothesis. Antonio Damasio comes up with the somatic hypothesis, provides the neurobiological mechanism for Haidt's intuitionism. Damasio argues that decision-making is guided by somatic markers, bodily states, for example, heart rate changes, gut tightening, sweating, associated with past emotional experiences. When we consider a moral transgression, the brain triggers a somatic state. So it seems like this is where people are at, even though the stuff feels magical and fake in some cases. So the somatic marker hypothesis, we've been talking about this all the time. I'm a big Damasio fan now. So when we consider a moral transgression, the brain triggers a somatic state, a gut check that signals danger or aversion. The signal is processed in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Without this somatic input, rational decision-making collapses because the agent cannot assign value to the different options. Phineas Gage. Oh man, classic. Absolutely goated for getting brain damage. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions. So right back to our consciousness video, how important lesions are at telling us what things are doing in the brain. The classic case of Phineas Gage, who suffered damage to his ventromedial prefrontal cortex, illustrates this. Gage retained his intellect and theoretical reasoning abilities, but lost his moral compass. He became impulsive, profane, and unable to make advantageous decisions. Yeah, if we lose a key part of our brain that deals with emotions, we become irrational and immoral. But when I give myself brain damage, no one cares. Shame. True, you just had to have done it first, Gage is actually the first person to ever suffer brain damage in the entirety of human history. Modern studies on patients with VMPFC damage show a specific pattern of moral judgment. They become hyper-rational or cold utilitarians. Yikes. In the footbridge version of the trolley problem, where one might push a large man off a bridge to stop a trolley, healthy people have a strong negative emotional reaction and refuse to push. But these patients, lacking this somatic alarm, see only the math. 1 death versus 5 deaths, and readily agree to push the man. This suggests that what we often call moral conscience is actually a somatic emotional break. Without it, we become ruthlessly rational in a way that most humans find abhorrent. The rationality of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex patient is a defective rationality because it fails to integrate social and emotional values essential for human survival. All right. Psychopathy and the failure of embodiment. Psychopathy offers a dark mirror to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage. Psychopaths often understand social rules, theoretical rationality, but do not feel them. Research indicates that psychopaths show reduced autonomic reactivity, for example, skin conductance responses or SCR, when imagining harm to others. They lack the somatic markers that usually inhibit antisocial behavior. In studies using the Iowa gambling task, healthy participants generate anticipatory skin conductance responses, sweaty palms, before making a risky choice, often before they consciously realize the choice is bad. Psychopaths and ventromedial prefrontal cortex patients do not generate this signal. This lack of physiological fear or aversion allows them to commit moral transgressions without the internal punishment of guilt or anxiety. Implication: moral rationality without moral emotionality results in monstrosity. The body is not an impediment to morality, it is its anchor. So this is actually something that the Routledge Handbook of Embodied Cognition did not include. It did not talk about psychopathy, I don't think. But that's also a great example here. Using the trolley problem to test brain damage is insane. They couldn't find something more concrete. Yeah, I know. I do think, or I do agree. It's very odd to use the trolley problem. I would probably want the experiments to be something so much more compelling. Like, as I mentioned, the idea of the pushing someone off. Like, you could have reservations for so many reasons. That said, the loss of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or the psychopaths, like the fact that they have such a different response to it is more compelling evidence. Because in theory, if you just had another reason why you wouldn't push the man into the track, and it wasn't just an emotional cue, then in theory that would show up in your rational thought. And they should still be able to have that type of response to it. However, that isn't the case. So, the vagus nerve and compassion. On the positive side of morality, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve X, plays a crucial role in compassion and care. Research at Berkeley has shown that the experience of compassion is linked to elevated vagal tone. Activation of the vagus nerve slows the heart rate and is associated with feelings of warmth and expansion in the chest. This is a measure of vagal tone, the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Studies show that greater RSA during the experience of compassion predicts pro-social behavior. People with higher resting vagal tone are more prone to altruism and are better at interpreting others' emotions. Stimulation studies. Some research suggests that transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation can enhance the capacity for self-compassion and emotion recognition, providing a direct causal link between the peripheral nervous system and moral sentiment. So these are both, in my mind, very compelling as well. This confirms that the body is actively involved in generating the motivation to help others, regulating the fight or flight response to allow for tend and befriend behaviors. Tend and befriend, who coined that? Interoception, listening to the heart. Recent studies have moved beyond the brain to the body's periphery. Interoception, the ability to sense internal bodily signals, heartbeat, digestion, correlate with moral intuition, so this was definitely included. Heartbeat evoked potentials. This is a brain signal that reflects the cortical processing of the heartbeat. Research shows that HEP amplitude is modulated during moral decision making. Specifically, the brain utilizes these interoceptive signals to differentiate between utilitarian and deontological choices. Interesting. 2024. Yo. And this is not a preprint, right? That's wild that Gemini's just throwing in 2024. So 2024 is when the Routledge Handbook of Embodied Cognition was published, or at least the second version was published. So this is something that was not even available to the author, and Gemini's just kind of throwing it in there, you know? All right, interoceptive accuracy. Individuals with higher interoceptive accuracy, those who are better at counting their own heartbeats without touching their pulse, feel stronger emotional conflict when making utilitarian choices in personal dilemmas. They are more tuned in to the somatic marker warning them against pushing the man off the bridge. Conformity, interestingly, high interoceptive awareness also correlates with aligning one's moral preferences with group consensus. This suggests that fitting in is a visceral bodily mediated drive potentially evolved to prevent social isolation. Okay, so a lot of this stuff seems pretty new and pretty exciting, actually. Just getting more of this type of evidence. All right, dual process theory, the battle between the head and heart. Joshua Greene's dual process theory synthesizes the rationalist and sentimentalist views by mapping them onto distinct brain systems. Greene proposes that we have two moral cognitive systems. All right, this is the first I'm hearing of this. System 1, automatic, emotional, fast, intuitive. Is this like the fast and slow guy? Fast, intuitive, and driven by the amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the system generates deontological judgments. For example, it is wrong to push the man regardless of consequences. Right. System 2, controlled, cognitive, slow, effortful, and driven by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The system generates utilitarian judgments. For example, save the most lives. Interesting. So it requires more of that high-level thinking to arrive at these types of judgments. The trolley problem experiments. Oh, man, they're all using the trolley problem. When people do choose to push the man in the footbridge case, their brains show a struggle, high amygdala activity, negative emotion, which is overridden by intense DL prefrontal cortex activity. So you're exerting a lot of top-down effort to counteract the bottom-up feeling that you're getting. This explains why utilitarian judgments take longer to produce in high conflict scenarios. The cognitive system needs time to suppress the emotional scream. So what this is pointing out is that there's both bottom-up and top-down effects on our moral reasoning, which for the rationalists, it's still damning, right? And you could also argue that even our top-down types of thinking are still in somewhat of a coordination with the rest of our body, not in a way that really affects our ability to, go through these reasons. But the question then is, like, what is rational? Is it the top down, or because I think the real rationalist argument is that there is such a thing as like true rational thought. Like, even if the top down thought does affect your rational decisions or your moral judgments, those top down thoughts are still contingent on your understanding of what is rational and what people do and what people should do and whatnot. So it's still contingent, and that still puts you into a problem. Is the takeaway from this to listen to your heart when it's calling for you? Perhaps that is the takeaway. That is actually, funny you say that. I don't know if it was half memeing, but one of the things that, this document's going to say over and over again is that the takeaway, one of the practical takeaways, is to be present and to pay attention to the signals that your body is telling you. And maybe it's not even just your body, that consciousness is telling you. Pay attention to those signals. I know this is now sounding very Jordan Peterson-esque. And he got that also from psychology, but also, archetypes and stories and whatnot. There's so many stories that show that paying attention is crucial. But yeah, in this case, we're paying attention for the signals that our body is giving us that something is wrong, that we understand something in a way that might be wrong given the information we just saw. And the other thing that our document tells us is that it is actually uncomfortable to actually entertain that possibility that you are wrong, or that there is something you should do right now. And that's a real tough thing. But so the document kind of calls on courage in a sense. I feel that this was already said by the Greeks 2,500 years ago. Are you saying the pay attention stuff or the listen to your heart? Yeah, absolutely. I think people figured this stuff out intuitively. People often talk of the meditation path as cultivating wisdom and love as two kind of linked, kind of independent aspects. Hey, I don't doubt it, because what we're seeing is people who are able to regulate their emotions are ending up to have more moral attitudes, let's just say, or more positive moral attitudes towards their peers. We saw how the heart rate affected people's moral judgments, and if you're able to lower your heart rate in the moment via mindfulness or any type of mechanism like that, then it would end up with that same outcome. I think I don't think people are just wrong when they don't have science. Like, I think you can arrive at incredibly wise intuitions over time. All right, cognitive load and moral judgment. Further evidence for this model comes from cognitive load studies when subjects are given a distractor task like memorizing a number sequence while making moral judgments. Their ability to make utilitarian judgments is impaired. The cognitive load occupies the resources of System 2, leaving the agent reliant on System 1. Consequently, subjects under load are less likely to choose the utilitarian option. This confirms that utilitarianism requires cognitive resources while deontological intuition is automatic. Critiques and nuances. Critics such as Haidt argue that the emotion equals deontology and reason equals utilitarianism mapping is too simplistic. They point out, I would say that's probably too simplistic. They point out that counterintuitive deontological duties, like Kant's refusal to lie to a murderer at the door, also require cognitive control to override the instinct to help the victim. Additionally, some studies show that utilitarian judgments are also driven by their own set of intuitions, just different ones. For example, an intuition for fairness or maximization. Despite these critiques, the dual process theory remains a robust framework for explaining the tension between our gut and our head. All right, embodied cognition, the dirty truth about morality. So this is the conclusion, I'm guessing. All right, embodied cognition research takes the dependence of morality on the body to a literal extreme. It suggests that our abstract moral concepts are metaphorically scaffolded onto physical experiences. Cleanliness. Oh, so this is now getting into stuff that we talked about. This isn't a conclusion. Cleanliness is next to godliness, is not just a saying, it is a psychological reality. The Macbeth effect describes the link between physical cleansing and moral purity. Research shows that people who recall an unethical deed are more likely to choose antiseptic wipes over other gifts. Physically washing hands after recalling a sin reduces the feeling of guilt. The cost of cleanliness. Disturbingly, washing hands can also reduce the motivation to engage in compensatory pro-social behavior. Once the participants felt clean, they felt less need to help others to atone for their transgression. So this is all stuff we read a few days ago. This effect interacts with individual differences. For example, engineering students who might be less prone to metaphorical thinking or have different disgust sensitivities showed a stronger Macbeth effect in some studies compared to social science students, suggesting complex moderators. Disgust and moral judgment. Oh, here we go. This is more fun than the fishy smell. Disgust is perhaps the most powerful embodied moral emotion, and originating as a food rejection system, it was co-opted by evolution to reject social contaminants. In a famous series of studies, they manipulated the physical environment. Participants sitting at a dirty desk or smelling a fart spray made significantly harsher moral judgments than those in a clean environment. The physical disgust bled over into moral disgust, leading to an amplification of condemnation. Dehumanization. Disgust is strongly linked to the dehumanization of outgroups. Viewing an outgroup as disgusting, comparing them to vermin, for example, bypasses moral concern and facilitates violence. Studies show that high disgust sensitivity predicts negative attitudes toward outgroups like immigrants or social minorities. And high disgust sensitivity is a part of trait conscientiousness. Right? A part of trait conscientiousness is actually orderliness and also includes disgust sensitivity. So that's how you could see a downside to conscientiousness. I mentioned earlier that there's not many downsides to conscientiousness, but here is one. Okay, we've got metaphorical mapping, weight, size, and light. Yeah, we saw this stuff. Size. People in larger rooms or physically elevated positions judge immoral acts more leniently, feeling above the law, or conversely, associate big with important moral weight. Wow, that was not in there. When did that come out? When are we talking about this? 2025. Wow. Demonstrate that the unconscious psychological relationship between moral concepts and the spatial dimension of size influences individuals' abstract moral judgments under embodied cognition. Jesus. Okay, man, this is too much. Size is now affecting. I'm wondering if people, like, who's taking a hold of these and like trying to leverage them? Like, are companies doing this? Are politicians doing this? Holding a heavy clipboard makes people take moral issues more seriously. Weight equals importance. Wow. In studies, participants holding a heavy clipboard allocated more funding to social causes than those holding a light clipboard. What is going on here? Science is moving. Science is moving quickly. A lot of stuff happening. People in dimmer rooms are more prone to cheating. Yep, we talked about that. These findings suggest that human morality is not a closed logical system, but an open system deeply permeable to environmental and somatic noise. All right, so 8, this is going to be the conclusion. Is morality rational? Addressing the user's second question, how rational is it, requires distinguishing between different types of rationality. The answer depends heavily on which definition of rational one employs. True. Type of rationality, epistemic rationality. Does the belief map to the truth? Status of human morality, low/mixed. Moral intuitions are subject to framing effects, environmental noise, and evolutionary biases that do not track objective moral truths. Okay. So it's low in that sense of rationality. Morality is not rational in the sense that it maps to some absolute truth. Okay, instrumental rationality. Does the system achieve its goals? High, evolutionarily. The system is highly effective at maintaining group cohesion, punishing cheaters, and facilitating cooperation, which is the goal of natural selection, quote unquote. So this is saying rational is like rational in the sense of, does it make sense why people do it? But that's not the usual type of rational that we're going for here. Coherence, logical rationality. Is the system internally consistent? Is the system internally consistent? Low, it's not rational in this sense. Humans are prone to moral dumbfounding and hold contradictory views due to the identifiable victim effect. Okay, so this is really taken away from I think what the notion of rational morality that I think we would usually consider. So a crucial distinction in moral psychology is between rationality, using reason to find the truth, and rationalization, using reason to defend a prior conclusion. The evidence from Haidt and others suggests that lay morality is dominated by rationalization. We act like lawyers defending a client, our intuition, not judges seeking the truth. This motivated reasoning is driven by the need to maintain social standing and consistency. However, this does not mean genuine moral rationality is impossible. The dual process model allows for System 2 to override System 1. We can think our way to new moral positions, for example, the expansion of rights to animals or LGBTQ plus individuals, but this requires cognitive effort and often social support to overcome the inertia of intuition. Right, so this all checks out. But really, what we feel to be rational in the moment is very much fundamentally System 1. And even though System 2 can affect it, which is this is the whole thesis of the document. We can use System 2 right now. We can think about this thing in the moment. We could do things right now that affects System 1 in the future. But we can't like control our deepest biological processes and our drives and whatnot in the moment. All right, the case for rational compassion. Paul Bloom, in Against Empathy, argues that empathy, a somatic emotional resonance, is a bad compass for morality because it is enumerated and biased. Oh my gosh, we got to read this. Against Empathy. What is happening here? When did this come out? 2016. Wow, that's a long time ago. 10 years. Empathy zooms in on the one, ignoring the many. Bloom advocates for rational compassion, a cognitive appreciation of the value of others without the distorting effects of sharing their pain. This suggests that while morality is currently dependent on emotion, it ought to be more rational to be effective in a complex world. Bloom's argument highlights that while we are biologically wired for emotional morality, we are capable of metacognition, thinking about our thinking, and choosing to prioritize rational outcomes. If that's all he says, then this book really falls short of what it needs to say. It's not that we just want to choose to prioritize rational outcomes, but really you would want to internalize the ethic of choosing to prioritize rational outcomes. You want to affect the System 1 intuitions such that your brain won't like it if you don't put in the effort of prioritizing rational outcomes. That's the whole point of what we're going to talk about in the thinking section of part 2. It's we want to study logical principles so that our brain forces us to follow those and is upset when we don't follow those. It's really going to allow us to notice these patterns, these logical patterns in our own lives, and in our own thought. But it requires us to it literally requires us to study it in order to internalize that information so that it does come into play in the moment. But yeah, this is, over time we want to gain this type of control over our emotional impulses. All right, synthesis, the integrated moral agent. The data presented paints a picture of a hybrid moral agent. We are not the rational angels of Kant's dreams, nor are we merely the emotional automatons of a biological machine. The necessity of emotion. Without the body, without the VM prefrontal cortex's somatic markers and the vagus nerve's compassion, we do not become perfectly rational moral agents. We become psychopaths or functionally debilitated. Emotion is necessary to provide the value and motivation for moral action. Pure reason can calculate consequences, but it cannot care about them. The necessity of reason, however, the body is biased, parochial, and easily disgusted by the benign. Evolution equipped us for the tribe, not the globe. Reason, System 2, allows us to detect these biases and correct them. Right, but so this is jumping the gun way too much. System 2 doesn't allow us to detect biases unless we have an understanding that those biases are possible. Like, we need to have the concept of the bias there in order to be able to recognize a bias. So this is not as effective as a story as we're going to get in our document here. And also, we can't just assume that System 2 is some separate process that is just not connected to the body at all. We will have to discuss how closely our System 2 processing is connected to the body. And that's kind of something we do next month. We're going to talk about how we're going to talk about focus, and we're going to talk about motivation at the deepest level, the what actually allows us to focus on something, what's happening during that, which is kind of a bummer that that's pretty low level, but I think we have to do it. We have to start off the part 2 that way. All right, it allows us to extend the moral circle beyond our immediate sensory range. All right, to answer the user's query, how much does morality depend on our body/emotions? Extensively. The very machinery of moral judgment is built upon the neural substrates of emotion. Our judgments are influenced by somatic states and physical environment. Without these emotional inputs, moral agency fragments. The Macbeth effect and Disgust studies show that even abstract moral concepts are grounded in physical metaphors. How rational is it? Descriptively, how we act, it is largely irrational or rationalizing. We mostly follow intuitions and use reasons to justify them. Functionally, evolutionarily, it is instrumentally rational for social bonding within small groups, but often maladaptive in large, complex society. We possess the capacity for rationality. It depends what we mean by rationality here. We can override our emotional dog, but it is an effortful, metabolically expensive process that requires training, optimal conditions, and a culture that values consistency. So that's a lot is happening in this culture that values consistency. Morality is an embodied skill. There we go. A dialogue between an ancient feeling primate and a modern reasoning mind. This is the takeaway that we're still going to leverage here. Recognizing this biological reality is the first step towards achieving the rational sentimentalism that philosophers have long sought. Okay, so let's do this stuff. Now, this is stuff that we're not going to need until part 3, but this is crucial stuff for our moral framework that we arrive at. All right, the practical framework, agency, responsibility, and heuristics. We now turn to the practical application. How does a specific agent navigate this landscape? The imperative of agency, internal consistency. We escape moral nihilism, not by appealing to God or reason, but by appealing to agency. To function as a coherent biological agent, one must retain consistency between one's predictive model and one's actions. So this isn't something that you have to be cognizant of. This is just how we operate. If an agent possesses a schema that predicts X is the right path, acting against X introduces voluntary prediction error, cognitive dissonance. This fragmentation undermines the agent's capacity to navigate the world. So this is slightly off how I would go about this. But it's pretty much pointing out that we have an understanding of the world, and when we're met with information, stimuli, that makes us feel a certain way, that tells us that is wrong. And now, in part 1 of the document, we're only concerned with the semantic structure of the world and how that connects with the normative nature of the world. Like, if something's incompatible with something else, if there's a conflict in your understanding, then there's some inherent understanding of what we must do in order to act as if these are incompatible. And so now we can build this up to the idea of moral understanding, where if, let's imagine, you're paying attention to your conscience and your conscience tells you that something is wrong and isn't in accordance with your own understanding of being a moral person, then perhaps you should give that some light. The responsibility to act morally is a responsibility to oneself to maintain the structural integrity of one's mind. So this isn't the way that we're going to go about it. It's not because we want to make sure we don't experience prediction error or negative emotions. It's just this is what's happening. The practical heuristic. Since we cannot know objective truth, we rely on the heuristic of our own dynamic understanding. The agent consults their current schema. Does this action align with my constructed understanding of a viable good life? So you don't have to go that far. It's just, is this moral or not? The agent accepts that alignment often requires allostatic load. So this is just random stuff that we talked about. Unfortunately, when you give feedback to Gemini, it will then highlight that feedback as like a feature of what it then creates. Doing the right thing may cause anxiety or pain, but it preserves the higher order stability of the agent's identity and long-term predictive success. That's not necessarily the case, right? You can succumb to things that are you believe to be immoral now that actually make it easier for you to feel like you're moral in the future. All right, the derived meta-ethic, facilitation. This framework implies a secondary forward-looking responsibility. So just to restate, because that didn't do a great job of it. What we're going to do in part 3 is, provided that you have an understanding of morality such that there's things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do, right? And this isn't saying that it's objectively true in the world. It's just saying that you have this understanding. Like you can reflect on it, you see it, you understand the very notion of morality, and you actually believe in it. Like you believe that, you should do things and you shouldn't do things. All that the document can say at the base level to create our entire moral framework is that you ought to figure out what those things are, what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. And then because of the very standards of your understanding of morality, that you should actually then do those. Yeah, we can get into all the part 2 stuff. You should do whatever is necessary to do those things. So in part 2, we tell you how to achieve your goals. Now you've just identified moral goals, things that you should do. You have all the tools that lead you to being able to do them, and so now you have all. We've supplied our entire moral framework by giving you the practical framework. And the question is, how do you then deal with how much you should do this thing, or how you because the life isn't just a single moral problem. It's going to be a problem of having a bunch of different things that you think are things you should do, how you should deal with that. So then it's going to be a larger discussion about managing values, managing things that you should be doing, how to deal with this stuff over time. That's going to be part 3 as well. Yeah, so our moral bud leads to a lot of discussion. But it also leads to some other types of meta-ethical responsibilities, like perhaps there's things that you can do now that not affect the immediate goals that you have, the immediate moral goals, but that will affect your ability to do moral goals going into the future. Any moral goal you come up with, what would be beneficial for you to be able to do? And one might be your ability to learn new information. Perhaps you have a moral obligation to increase your ability to do things in the world, or learn things in the world, or whatever. We're going to have to figure out how to do this without going too far. It's gonna kind of introduce that type of thinking. So to clarify your document's position regarding morality, the document prescribes searching for an ethical framework and following it. Yes. And it gives you tools for figuring out how you ought to manage that. So one of the things that, because what you just said is very simple. So one of the things that we have to mention, one of the deepest parts of the part 3 in terms of the moral stuff that we're gonna have to mention is, it is possible for you to follow what you think to be moral, and based on the social environment that you're around, your conscience can be calibrated to a point where you end up feeling like things that feel moral in the moment are things that you would have previously found very much immoral. So I always bring up this example as the ultimate example, the book of Ordinary Men, how ordinary men ended up carrying out the Holocaust. And it points out how it's not like these men were like evil from the get-go. It was an incremental change where you could say their conscience was recalibrated over a long period of time, relatively speaking, given that they were in social groups where they saw other people doing it, so they thought it was fine. And a lot of the time, there was cognitive dissonance, but that cognitive dissonance goes away once you just let go of it. So at some point, you can't just follow what you believe to be moral. There needs to be some other mechanism in there that allows you to over time, to ensure that you're not going in a direction that you wouldn't otherwise like to go. Now, the question is, the difficulty here is like, how do you know that where you were wasn't the immoral? And so there's almost a necessity to also ground your moral framework in some tangible heuristic, which we're gonna have to come up with. You need something that allows you to point in a direction that isn't just what you believe to be true or moral in the moment. So there's going to be a lot to discuss in our moral framework, but it's going to be that bottom level. Like it's gonna have to be fundamental. We can't go up into you ought to. I say this all the time. We can't get to the point where we say you ought not kill, or you ought to hold the door open for someone, or you ought to pay your taxes. Like we can't get there. We're not allowed to. That's too high level. But we can talk about these things at a very low abstract level. All right, we must live ethics. Amen. Well, actually, so the only reason that we're going to talk about ethics in part 3 of this document, because the part 3 of this document doesn't really care whether you're moral, like most directly. The only reason we talk about ethics is because, and we're going to have to build the case for this. I'm going to have to actually learn this, but this is my intuition. Feeling that you are doing something moral and big in that sense affects your well-being. And that's what we're really looking for in part 3. We're looking for how do you feel like your life is meaningful? And it seems like morality is a huge part of that. That's the only reason we're going to do that. So it's not that we must live ethics. It's that if you want to live a meaningful life, then perhaps you should live ethics. That's going to be it. And that's a prescription that isn't like a moral prescription. It's a prescription based on the goal that you have. Just like how, if you want to get to the top of the steps, you should walk up the steps. Something like that. Moral obligation is a slippery slope, right? It's tricky. That's why we have to stay only where we're allowed to stay. We're starting with rock bottom, and we're only going to build as far as we can build.